welcome to my home here in Halifax County, North Carolina, just outside the town of Enfield. My name is Coy Herbert. My parents are Henry and Nanette Herbert. So my mom, who was originally a Sykes, grew up here with her two brothers, Ray and Terry, and their parents, Raymond and Shirley Sykes. What you're about to watch is a story about the Sykes family, a piece of property known as the Parker Farm, and a family secret nobody seemed to know they were keeping.
And now for the rest of the story.
My mom's side of the family has always had a rich tradition of keeping family history, passing it on from one generation to the next. My granddaddy especially was always known for knowing everything about everybody and telling you more than you ever wanted to know. He and his sisters were always quick to share stories about their life growing up here in Halifax County.
This love of stories would lead to the production of Recollections, a Sykes family memoir. A 2-volume family history is told first by my great-aunt Margaret Sykes Jackson, and then by my great-aunt Naomi Sykes Smith, compiled and edited by my Uncle Terry. The subject of many of their stories was their life growing up at their home on the Parker Farm, and how they came to live there. This story begins in the latter part of the 19th century with my twice great-grandparents, Milton and Molly Sykes. They had a farm near Ward's Crossroad, just outside Enfield, often referred to as the Old Home Place. They had 7 children, 3 daughters, and 4 sons, including my great-granddaddy, Thomas May. Milton died when May was only 19. At that point, his other brothers did not have much interest in farming and went to work in the local mill. May worked in the mill for a while, but decided he would rather farm. May married my great-grandma, Dolly Millie Milton, in November of 1912. He was 22 and she was 19. They then moved in with Dolly's parents until their first child, Luther McGlynn, also known as Glenn, was born in 1913. After that, they moved back and began to farm the old home place. May was able to avoid being drafted during World War I because by that time he was a father and a farmer, which made him exempt. The next child, Irma Naomi, my Aunt Naomi Smith, came in September 1916. After Naomi, the children began to come more regularly, averaging one about every 18 months. Next was Thomas Rowland in November 1917, who died as a baby. Then came Geneva May, also known as Nick, the origin of which is a whole nother story, in October 1918. Then Millie Ruth in August 1920, Margaret Lizzie Bell, my Aunt Margaret Jackson, in February 1922, Raymond May, my granddaddy, in December 1923, Mary Ellen in October 1925, and then finally the twins, Annie Jean and Connie Jeanette, in October 1930. In all, 9 living children. In 1922, May, Dolly, and their then 4 children moved to the Randolph farm, where May worked as a tenant farming overseer. In 1927, with an opportunity to earn more money, May took an overseer's job for the Popes, who rented them a house in Enfield to live in. After 3 months, they were able to move into the big house on the Pope farm itself. With the offer of another raise, after 2 years, the family, now at 7, moved again to the wood farm in Edgecombe County. In 1932, wanting to strike out on his own as a farmer, May moved his family back to Halifax County to the Parker Farm. My great-aunt, Margaret Sykes Jackson, recalled her father's choice to set up farming on his own. Daddy worked as an overseer until we left the wood farm. He probably could have continued to be an overseer for someone for as long as he liked doing so, but he now had a house full of children. Jean and Jeanette were born at the wood farm. He knew as a salaried man, and until he could go on his own, that his children could not have what he wanted for them. Daddy decided to farm for himself, and when we left the wood farm, we moved to the Parker Farm. Daddy rented the farm in Halifax County from a Mr. Sproul. It belonged to 2 old sisters who lived in Richmond, Virginia. They were Sally and Miss Katie Parker. After years of moving around, May and his family finally settled down on a place of their own. They lived on the Parker farm for many years, and this property was what his children would regard as their true home. However, Dolly had always said, "I don't have anything. Everything's always May's." So in 1944, May and Dolly moved one last time to the nearby Viverett farm. My great-aunt Naomi Smith recalls that when Daddy bought the Viverett farm just west of Glenview, he said, "Darling, this is your farm." Daddy would have bought the Parker farm, but it was not for sale. Those two sisters in Richmond still owned it. This farm meant a lot to Dolly, being in Glenview Crossroads where she herself grew up. All but the twins, Jean and Jeanette, had by this time grown up and moved away. My granddaddy had just been called into service in World War II in 1944 and returned home by Christmas in 1945, so they added on a bedroom for him. He would work with this farm and help run the store at Glenview alongside his dad.
This farm and their house, built in 1890, is the one that I currently still live in with my family. And his room, with still a little more added on, is now my room.
But the story's not over yet for the Parker farm. Raymond married Shirley Lavender, a nurse from Macon, Georgia, in 1951. They had 3 children, Ray, Terry, and Nanette, my mom, of course. He built a house just a few yards down the road from his parents and continued to farm that property and others in the area, as well as run the store. In 1965, after the death of the old sisters in Richmond, the opportunity came about for my granddaddy to buy the Parker farm. Since this had been the property that he regarded as his home, it meant a lot to him to finally own it. As Margaret acknowledges, the Parker farm house was an eyesore when we moved there, but it became home to me, and I suppose to most of us. I don't remember any really unhappy times in any of our houses. There were some sad things everywhere, but the good things outweighed the bad. Fast forward now to the late 80s. Ray and his wife Susan settled on the Parker farm in another home on the property with the intentions of restoring the original house and starting a family. Unfortunately, by that point though, the house was in rough shape and had to be torn down.
In the mid-90s, a new home was built on this property, utilizing the old floors and mantles from the original Parker farm house. Uncle Terry has said that travelers often think that this house was the original one and had been restored. However, it was built in the Federal style, which actually predates the original Parker farm house, which he believed to have been built around the time of the Civil War.
Together, they had 3 children, Thomas, Emery, and Susanna. Unfortunately, though, in more recent times, Ray and Susan have divorced, and Ray was forced to sell the home, though the adjacent farmland is still owned by he and Terry. All of my granddad's farmland was held under the control of Sylvan Hill Farms, which was passed to Ray, Terry, and my mom, following Granddaddy's death in 2001 and Grandma Shirley's in 2008. After years of conflicting interest about how to best handle the farm, the corporation was finally dissolved in 2010, leaving my parents with ownership of the former Viverett farm and the other properties, and Ray and Terry with their parents' home and the Parker farm. The Parker farm. That was always the name I had heard used to refer to the particular piece of property that my grandfather grew up on and where my cousins lived. That's how farms are referred to, by names of families who had owned them in the past that may or may not still own them. I can think of many examples. The Pope farm, the Randolph farm, the O.J. Smith farm. Even my dad's farm is known as the Ward farm. I don't know who the Wards are, and have never really given it much thought. So the question of the origin of the Parkers of the Parker farm, like the Wards, was not something I had ever really considered.
Now, I'll admit, when it comes to history, I'm kind of a huge nerd, especially when it comes to American and Civil War history. It even goes so far as when I was little, I pretended I was a Confederate officer and fight battles in my backyard. And I'd always used to look for someone or something that connected me to the past, and be it related to the Civil War, even better. But alas, my family history doesn't bear much. Say Milton may or may not have served, but can't really tell for sure. But it was this love of history that would lead me to want to come.
Here recently I've been watching a lot of that show that comes on TLC, Who Do You Think You Are? If you don't know it, it's where celebrities go on it and find out about their own family histories. Inevitably, I would end up pulling out both recollections and the books of family trees Mom made on Ancestry.com and refresh my memory about my own family tree. On one episode of Who Do You Think You Are, they utilized a website called newspapers.com to do research. I was interested in finding more about my parents' common ancestor, Alfred Cook.
Yeah, I said that right. My parents share a set of twice great-grandparents. My 3 times. But that's a whole nother story. So when I looked and couldn't find much about Alfred, Mom mentioned, just sort of in passing, that the Parker farm may or may not have belonged to a Colonel Parker, and that it was from his daughters, say the old sisters in Richmond, that Granddaddy had bought the farm. Do what? Undoubtedly, as a pre-service social studies teacher, this piqued my interest. But in all of my great-aunt's recollections and all of my mom's memory, no one could identify this Colonel Parker in question. So who is Colonel Parker? Is he significant? What war did he fight in? What did he do? Why has no one told me about this?
So a quick search of newspapers.com revealed that it was the Civil War, and that there was a Colonel F.M. Parker with the 13th North Carolina Regiment. And a subsequent search of the National Park Service Index of Civil War Soldiers revealed that he was the distinguished Colonel Francis Marion Parker, whose division was under Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, who fought in seemingly every major battle, every significant campaign, and was 3 times wounded in battle at Antietam, Gettysburg, and Spotsylvania. Antietam, Gettysburg, and Spotsylvania? I've been to Gettysburg. I saw the high water mark, Cemetery Ridge, the 30th Maine's position on Little Round Top, where Lieutenant Colonel Chamberlain made his famous swinging gate maneuver, had my picture taken with the Confederate memorial. And all this time, my family had owned the farm of a colonel who was there? Needless to say, I was shocked. And now you know the rest of the story.
Okay, wait a minute. But I still have so many questions. Okay, yes, I do know who Colonel Frank Parker is now and who he was and why he was significant. But why didn't I know this all along? Why didn't my mom know this all along? I mean, she knew that the Parker farm belonged to these old sisters in Richmond and that there was a colonel involved, but not his true identity. Say, and if my great aunts or my Uncle Terry knew this, why wasn't it included in recollections? And if my granddaddy knew, wouldn't this have been something he'd have talked about a lot? And if my Uncle Ray knew, having lived there, wouldn't this have been something he bragged about? I know I would, or will.
Unfortunately, though, my granddaddy, of course, has passed away, as well as his sisters, Margaret and Naomi. In fact, all but 2 of May and Dolly's children have passed away, Mary Ellen and Jeanette. Also, the years of conflicting interest have left my mother's relationship with her brothers tenuous. Also another long story. Such that I can't easily just call them up and ask, if you know what I mean.
So now I guess you really do know the rest of the story.